The feedback from the microphone screeched, sending a spike of pure agony through my skull. To most people, it was just a loud noise, but for me, it felt like a hot needle being driven into my brain. My father, Sterling Halston, didn't care. He stood on the golden stage of the Halston Empire Gala, his hand gripping my arm hard enough to leave dark bruises against my skin. He looked out at the room full of billionaire investors and tech moguls with a sneer that made my stomach turn. "Look at her," he shouted into the microphone, his voice booming through the speakers and rattling my very bones. "You expect me to leave my legacy, the Halston medical empire, to this?" He shoved me roughly, and I stumbled over the hem of my expensive gown. My hearing aids, the custom-made devices I relied on to navigate the world's noise, clattered to the floor like cheap plastic toys. The room went silent, but for me, the silence was filled with the roar of my own blood. Sterling laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "She can't even hear the stock market bell, let alone run a company," he mocked, pointing at me as I knelt to find my devices. "Ophelia is a broken instrument. She is a liability to the family image." He turned his back on me and gestured to his stepson, Knox. Knox stood there with a smug grin, already looking like he owned the stage. "Knox is the future," Sterling announced to thunderous applause. "Ophelia is finished." Two security guards stepped forward, grabbing me by the shoulders. As they dragged me away, the crowd began to whisper and point. I locked eyes with my father one last time, seeing nothing but ice in his gaze. "My name is Ophelia Halston. The world thought I was deaf, but the truth was much more complicated. I had hyperauditory processing disorder. The world wasn't too quiet for me, it was far too loud. But as the guards threw me out into the pouring rain, the only thing I truly heard was the silence of a father's heart turning into stone. I sat in the mud of the dark alleyway outside the gala venue, clutching my torn, mud-stained dress. The rain was coming down in sheets, cold and unforgiving. I reached for my phone, hopping to call a cab, but the screen was dead. My father had remotely wiped all my devices and cut off my access to every bank account. I was Ophelia Halston, daughter of a billionaire, and I had exactly $0 to my name. The side door of the venue creaked open, and Knox stepped out. He was smoking an expensive cigar, the orange tip glowing in the dark rain. He walked over to where I sat and looked down at me like I was something he had found stuck to the bottom of his shoe. He saw my hearing aid lying on the pavement, and with a slow, deliberate movement, he kicked it into the sewer grate. "Don't bother coming back, sis," he said, his voice grating on my nerves like sandpaper. "Dad canceled your medical insurance, too. You're on your own now." He laughed, a jagged sound that sent ripples of pain through my sensitive ears, and then he disappeared back inside to join the party. I watched the expensive device sink into the dark, rushing water of the sewer. I didn't cry. I didn't have the energy for tears. Stripped of the technology I used to dampen the world's noise, the environment became an overwhelming assault of sound. The rain sounded like gunfire hitting the pavement. The wind sounded like a screaming ghost. But then I heard something else. Deep beneath the chaos, I heard a distant, rhythmic hum. It was the building's massive backup generator. My ears didn't just hear the noise, they heard the frequency. I could hear a slight hitch in the rotation, a tiny mechanical fault that no human or computer would ever notice. I realized in that moment that I wasn't broken. I was calibrated differently. My weakness was actually a superpower, and I was going to use it to take back everything they stole from me. 3 months later, I was living in a grim, shared apartment in a part of the city my father wouldn't even drive through. I was working 3 low-paying jobs just to stay alive, but my real life began when I got home at night. I spent my few free hours dumpster diving behind major tech firms, collecting discarded motherboards, sensors, and wiring. My roommates thought I was crazy, but I was building something the world had never seen. I built a makeshift soundproof booth in my tiny closet. Inside that silence, I began to code. I developed an algorithm based on my own condition. If I could visualize sound waves, I could control them. I worked until my eyes bled, focused on a single goal, creating a sensor that didn't just listen to a heartbeat, but analyzed the very frequency of emotional stress. I knew that when a person lies, their heart emits a specific, dissonant frequency. It's a tiny tremor in the cardiac rhythm that traditional machines miss, but my ears, and now my code, could find it. I tested the prototype on myself every night. I would think of my father and monitor the spike in my cortisol levels. The device was flawless. It could predict a panic attack or a surge of anger 10 minutes before it even happened. This wasn't just a medical tool. It was the ultimate lie detector. It was a way to force the world to be as honest as the frequencies I heard in my head. I looked at the small, glowing device on my workbench. It was small enough to fit inside a human chest and powerful enough to topple an empire. I decided to name the prototype the Ghost, because it saw the things people tried to keep hidden in the shadows of their own hearts. 5 years passed. Sterling Halston was still on the cover of Forbes, but he looked different. He was older, paler, and his eyes looked haunted. The headlines were no longer just about him, though. Every tech and medical journal was obsessed with a new mystery. Who is the brilliant Dr. O? I had reinvented myself completely. I was the CEO of Oral Tech, a company that had started in a closet and was now overtaking Halston Industries in quarterly profits. I sat in my glass-walled office, overlooking the city that had once spat me out into the mud. I wore custom noise-canceling headphones that allowed me to focus in a world that was still too loud. My assistant, Imani, walked in with a digital file. "We have a purchase order for the Silent Pulse prototype," she said. The Silent Pulse was my masterpiece, the perfected version of the Ghost, a heart-monitoring technology that used sound waves to regulate cardiac rhythm. "It's a rush job, VIP client." I opened the file, and my breath hitched. The patient was Sterling Halston. He was dying of stress-induced cardiomyopathy, a fatal arrhythmia that made his heart beat like a frantic, trapped bird. Traditional pacemakers couldn't handle his erratic rhythms. He needed my technology to survive, but because I worked through layers of legal shells and the Dr. O persona, he had no idea he was begging his broken daughter for his life. The surgery was scheduled at the Halston Medical Center, the very place my father had named after himself. Sterling was so arrogant that even while dying, he refused to meet with Dr. O in person, dealing only with my high-priced legal team. He was desperate, his heart failing more with every passing hour. I sat in my office and reviewed the final paperwork authorizing the use of my prototype. I picked up a digital pen, but I didn't just sign my name. I opened the source code for the specific unit being sent to the hospital. I added a single, hidden line of code, a remote access protocol. It was encrypted with a biometric key that only my voice and my fingerprints could activate. I wasn't just giving my father a heart monitor, I was giving him a leash. I was giving him a piece of myself that would live inside his chest and report back to me every time his pulse quickened. He wanted to own the world, but soon I would own the very rhythm of his life. "Ship it," I told Imani, handing the file back to her. "And send Knox a complimentary fruit basket. He's going to need the comfort food for what's coming next." Imani nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. She was the only one who knew the truth, and she knew that the Silent Pulse was about to become the loudest thing in Sterling Halston's world. On the day of the surgery, I hacked into the hospital's secure camera feed from my penthouse. I watched in high definition as the surgeons opened my father's chest and implanted the Silent Pulse device. It was a small, silver disc that looked harmless, but it was the most advanced piece of audio-biomedical engineering on the planet. The moment the surgeons activated the device, Sterling's vitals on the monitor stabilized into a perfect, rhythmic wave. I watched through the camera as his eyes fluttered open in the recovery room. He took a deep, clear breath, the first one he'd had in months, and a look of immense relief washed over his face. My stepmother, Corinne, was by his side instantly, holding his hand. I watched her lips move on the silent screen. "Now we can focus on destroying that rival company," she whispered to him, her eyes gleaming with greed. "Dr. O won't know what hit him. We'll take Oral Tech and make it part of the Halston empire." I tapped a command on my tablet screen, a small adjustment to the frequency. In the recovery room, Sterling's heart rate monitor suddenly skipped a beat, the loud beep 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 echoing through the room. He gasped, clutching his chest as a sharp tremor ran through his heart. The doctors rushed in, checking the wires, but they found nothing wrong. Testing, testing, I whispered to my empty office, watching my father's panicked face on the monitor. He thought he was safe, but he had just invited his judge and jury to live right next to his soul. Sterling was back at work much sooner than the doctors recommended. He couldn't help himself. He had a company to run and a reputation to polish. A few weeks after the surgery, he stood in the Halston boardroom, giving a televised speech about how Halston Industries was ethically superior to its competitors. I sat in my office, watching the live stream of his biodata on my tablet. My screen was a maze of moving graphs, tracking his heart rate, his oxygen levels, and most importantly, his stress markers. For the first half of the speech, his markers remained low. He actually believed the lies he was telling about his company's charitable work. But then he took a dramatic pause and looked into the camera. "I have always put family first," he said with a practiced, fatherly smile. Lie. The algorithm on my tablet spiked instantly, the green lines turning a violent, jagged red. The device inside his chest recognized the dissonance of the lie. I adjusted the frequency on my tablet, sending a low-level haptic pulse directly to his heart. In the boardroom, Sterling suddenly grabbed his chest, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He winced, his voice faltering. "Just indigestion," he gasped, trying to force another smile. The board members looked at each other with worried expressions. I smiled to myself as I watched the data stabilize once he stopped talking about family. The silent pulse wasn't just keeping him alive, it was punishing him for the dissonance between his words and his heart. He didn't know it yet, but the truth was no longer optional for him. Sterling's health continued to be unpredictable, which meant Knox had to step up and handle more of the company's high-stakes negotiations. I watched through a hidden feed as Knox tried to close a massive deal with a Japanese tech firm. It was painful to watch. He was arrogant, ill-prepared, and he was completely butchering the technical details of the merger. Sterling, who was sitting in the back of the room, couldn't stand it anymore. He stepped in to save the deal, but to do so, he had to lie through his teeth about Halston Industries' current solvency and their failing R&D department. Every time he exaggerated a number or made a false promise, I increased the haptic feedback on his heart monitor using my tablet. It wasn't enough to cause a heart attack, not yet, but it was uncomfortable. It felt like a frantic, fluttering bird was trapped inside his ribs, beating its wings against his lungs. Sterling started sweating profusely, his collar becoming soaked. He began to stammer, his legendary confidence crumbling as the physical sensation of his own lies became unbearable. He had to end the meeting early, claiming a sudden bout of exhaustion. The Japanese investors looked unimpressed, and Knox was left standing there, looking like a humiliated amateur. I closed the app on my tablet and leaned back in my chair. My father was beginning to realize that something was very wrong, but he had no idea that his own, broken, daughter was the one pulling the strings. Back at his mansion, Sterling was becoming paranoid. He called his private doctor in the middle of the night, complaining about the heart monitor. "The device feels judgmental," he said, packing the room while his doctor ran a series of remote diagnostics. He sounded half crazy, even to himself. The doctor checked the logs and shook his head. "Sir, the device is working perfectly," he reported. "In fact, its performance is record-breaking. It's perfectly synced with your cortisol levels and your heart's natural electrical signals. Maybe you should try relaxing. Your stress levels are off the charts." Sterling didn't want to relax, he wanted to win. He threw an expensive vase against the wall, the sound of it shattering sending a jolt of pleasure through my remote sensors. "I don't want to relax," he screamed. "I want to buy Dr. O's company. I want to own the person who built this thing and make them fix it." He turned to Knox, who was standing by the door. "Initiate a hostile takeover of Oral Tech," Sterling ordered, his voice cold and dangerous. "Use every legal trick in the book. Sue them, bury them in paperwork, whatever it takes. I want Dr. O on his knees by the end of the month." I heard every word through the silent pulse secondary microphone. The hunt was on, but the predator didn't realize he was already in the trap. The hostile takeover began a week later. Knox arrived at the Oral Tech lobby with a small army of lawyers, all of them wearing suits that cost more than my first car. He demanded to see Dr. O immediately, acting as if he already owned the building. I didn't go down to meet him. Instead, I sent a Manny down to handle the guests. Dr. O does not take unplanned meetings, Imani said, her voice cool and professional. Knox scoffed and slammed a thick legal subpoena onto the reception desk. "We're suing for patent infringement," he announced loudly, making sure the other employees could hear. "We'll bury this little startup in court for the next decade unless you sell to Halston Industries today." I was watching the whole scene from the mezzanine, hidden behind a wall of tinted glass. I reached out and triggered the building's PA system, but I didn't play music or make an announcement. Instead, I programmed it to emit a specific high-frequency whine, the kind that only people under the age of 30 can usually hear. Knox, who was 26, suddenly dropped the subpoena and covered his ears in agony. He doubled over, his face contorted as the sound pierced his eardrums. The older lawyers, who had lost that range of hearing years ago, looked at him in total confusion. They saw him screaming and clutching his head, but they heard nothing but the hum of the air conditioning. "What's wrong with you?" one of the lawyers asked as Knox scrambled toward the exit, nearly falling over a potted plant. He fled the building, his hostile takeover ending in a humiliating retreat. I turned off the frequency and went back to my desk. This was only the beginning of their discomfort. Sterling realized that a legal battle would take too long, and his heart, or rather my device, wasn't giving him that much time. To settle the patent lawsuit once and for all, he demanded a face-to-face meeting with Dr. O. He chose the location, the upcoming Medical Innovation Ball. It was the exact same event, at the exact same venue, where he had disowned me 5 years ago. The irony was poetic. I spent the entire day preparing, not out of fear, but with the cold focus of a soldier going into a battle they had already won. I wasn't the scared girl in the torn dress anymore. I put on a structural, blood-red gown that made me look like a queen. But the most important part of my outfit was the jewelry. I put in my custom-made, diamond-encrusted hearing aids. To the rest of the world, they looked like expensive accessories. To me, they were the master control unit for my father's heart. With a simple tap on the diamonds, I could adjust the frequency of the silent pulse inside Sterling's chest. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. My posture was different, my eyes were harder. I didn't look like a broken instrument anymore. I looked like the person who decided when the music stopped. "Time to go home, Ophelia," I whispered to the reflection. I walked into the ballroom of the Medical Innovation Ball, and the effect was instant. The loud chatter of 1,000 wealthy guests died down to a murmur as I passed. No one recognized me at first. My hair was a different color, my style was light years beyond the girl they remembered, and I commanded the room with a power they couldn't ignore. Sterling and Corrine were at the center of the room, holding court with a group of nervous-looking investors. They were laughing and drinking champagne, trying to project an image of health and stability. As I approached their circle, Sterling squinted at me, his eyes searching my face for a memory he had tried to erase. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice booming with its usual arrogance. "Are you the representative from Oral Tech? Where is Dr. O?" "I'm the CEO of Oral Tech," I said, my voice steady and clear through the room's silence. I stepped closer, so close I could hear the faint, rhythmic hum of the silent pulse beneath his tuxedo. "But since we're family, Father, you can just call me Ophelia." The silence that followed was absolute. I watched the champagne glass slip from Corrine's hand and shatter on the marble floor. Sterling's face turned a violent shade of purple, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and terror. "You!" he choked out, his hand instinctively going to his chest. "You're Dr. O." Sterling didn't want to make a scene in front of the investors, so he grabbed my arm and dragged me toward a secluded corner of the ballroom. His grip was just as tight as it had been 5 years ago, but this time, it didn't make me stumble. He was the one whose hand was shaking. "You stole this technology from me?" he hissed, his face inches from mine. "I gave you everything, and you used my own company's resources to build a rival empire. I'm going to have you arrested for corporate theft and espionage." I wouldn't get so worked up, Father, I said calmly, glancing down at the diamond earring I was subtly tapping. My sensors show your heart rate is currently 110 beats per minute. That's dangerous for a man in your condition. He scoffed, trying to regain his old dominance. You're bluffing, he spat. That device is a medical tool, not a remote-controlled toy. You can't do anything to me. I didn't argue. I just swiped a finger downward on the screen of the small phone hidden in my palm. Instantly, Sterling's knees buckled. His heart skipped 3 beats in a row, a massive pause that left him gasping for air. He collapsed against a pillar, clutching my arm not to hurt me but to keep from falling. Stop it, he wheezed, his eyes filled with a sudden, primal fear. I waited a few seconds, letting him feel the cold weight of his own mortality, before I eased the frequency back to a stable rhythm. Sterling leaned against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the color slowly returned to his face. He looked at me as if I were a ghost that had come back to haunt him. What did you do to me? He whispered, his voice trembling. I simply calibrated the device to the frequency of truth, I replied, leaning in so only he could hear me over the distant ballroom music. I designed the algorithm to detect the specific cardiac dissonance caused by deceit and emotional malice. Every time you lie, Sterling, your heart enters atrial fibrillation. Every time you get angry at the truth, it slows down to a crawl. He looked at me with pure terror. He had spent his entire life building an empire on a foundation of lies, secret deals, and backstabbing. For a man like him, I hadn't just given him a medical device. I had put a gun to his head that was wired directly to his own conscience. If you want to live, Father, you have to be honest, I told him, my voice as cold as the mud I had sat in 5 years ago. And you have to remain calm. From this moment on, your survival depends entirely on your ability to tell the truth. I left him leaning against the pillar, a billionaire who was now a prisoner of his own heart. I walked away from Sterling and headed toward the buffet line, acting as if nothing had happened. Knox approached me almost immediately, his face twisted in a sneer. He didn't know about the heart monitor's secret functions yet. He just saw me as the sister who was trying to steal his inheritance. I know you rigged Dad's heart, Knox hissed, trying to use his height to intimidate me. I'll have our best engineers open him up and cut that piece of junk out of him myself. We don't need you. Go ahead and try, I said, picking up a small appetizer. The silent pulse has a tamper-proof failsafe. If it loses connection to my private server for even a millisecond, or if it detects an unauthorized surgical tool, it stops packing entirely. He'll be dead before you can even get him on the table. I turned to Corrine, who was standing just a few feet away, her face pale behind her heavy makeup. By the way, stepmother, I said, my voice rising slightly. I found the medical records from when I was 12. Do you remember that ear infection that supposedly caused my hearing loss? It wasn't an infection. It was an overdose of ototoxic antibiotics that you administered to a child. Sterling, who had limped back toward us, heard every word. He looked at Corrine with a sudden, sharp suspicion. Is that true? He asked her, his voice low and dangerous. Corrine didn't hesitate. No, she's lying, Sterling. I would never hurt a child. Sterling's heart monitor didn't react, he believed her. But my own monitor did. I pulled out my phone and played a crystal-clear audio recording of her confession to her therapist, which I had hacked weeks ago. The medical innovation ball ended in chaos for the Halston family. I sat in my quiet apartment that night, drinking tea and watching the data feeds from my surveillance system. I had managed to tap into the audio system of Sterling's private limousine as they drove home. I listened as Sterling erupted in fury at Corrine. He was screaming at her for what she had done to my ears, but even in his anger, he tried to lie to himself. He tried to say that it didn't matter now, that they could still stick together to defeat Oral Tech. The sound of the electric shock was audible through the microphone. Sterling let out a strangled scream as the device punished the lie he was telling his own heart. He realized in that moment that the device wasn't just a lie detector for the world. He couldn't even lie to himself anymore without being physically assaulted by his own pulse. Get out, Sterling roared, and I watched the GPS dot for Kareen's phone separate from the limo's icon on my screen. He had kicked her out of the car in the middle of the highway. The family was fracturing, just as I had planned. I leaned back and watched the two dots move in opposite directions across the map. The empire was beginning to crumble from the inside out. The next day, Sterling went to the Halston Industries headquarters, looking like a man who hadn't slept in a week. He was desperate to regain control, and he called an emergency meeting to fire the board members who had been seen talking to me at the gala. He stood in front of them, his hands shaking as he held his prepared notes. "I am removing you from the board," Sterling began, his voice raspy. Because your recent performance has been..." He stopped, clutching his chest. He was trying to say they were incompetent, but it was a lie, and the device knew it. The board members had actually been doing a great job. He just wanted them gone because they were a threat to his power. "Why are you firing me, Sterling?" one of the members asked, leaning forward with a frown. Sterling tried to force out another lie, but the pain in his chest became so intense he actually doubled over, gasping for air. He realized he couldn't say the words. The only way to make the pain stop was to speak the truth he was trying to hide. "Because you threaten my absolute control," he finally blurted out, the words ripped from him by the sheer agony of the cardiac frequency. "Because I'm terrified that Ophelia is smarter than me and you all know it." The board was dead silent, shocked by his sudden, brutal honesty. Sterling slumped into his chair, defeated by his own heart. While Sterling was failing in the boardroom, Knox was becoming truly dangerous. He was a man who had never been told no, and he was watching his future disappear. That night, I was working in my apartment when the front door was kicked open. Knox burst in, his eyes wild and bloodshot, holding a gun. "Turn it off," he screamed, pointing the weapon at my head. "He's dying, Ophelia. He can't even sleep anymore because he dreams of lies and wakes up choking on his own heart. You're killing him." I didn't flinch. I didn't even stand up from my desk. I looked at him with a calm that seemed to make him even angrier. "I can't turn off his conscience, Knox," I said quietly. "I only gave him the tool. He's the one who chooses to fight it." Knox's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could pull it, I tapped the side of my diamond-encrusted hearing aid. I had wired my home security system to emit a concentrated, high-frequency sonic blast if I gave the command. The sound hit Knox like a physical wall. He dropped the gun and fell to his knees, clutching his ears and screaming in a pitch that matched the alarm. My security team, who had been waiting in the next room, rushed in and pinned him to the floor. I stood up and looked down at my stepbrother as they handcuffed him. "Tell Dad I'll see him at the shareholders' meeting tomorrow," I said, my voice cold and final. "It's time for the final performance." The day of the annual Halston Industries shareholders' meeting arrived. It was held in a massive auditorium downtown, with thousands of investors in the seats and millions more watching the live stream. Backstage, I found Sterling. He looked like a ghost, his skin gray and his eyes sunken. He was actually hooked up to a portable IV drip just to keep him standing. When he saw me, he didn't scream or threaten me. He fell to his knees and begged. "Ophelia, please," he wept, his voice a broken whisper. "I'll give you anything. I'll give you $100 million. I'll give you the estate. Just turn off the frequency. I can't live like this anymore." "I don't want your money, Sterling," I said, looking down at the man who had once been a titan in my eyes. "And I don't want your house. I want the truth. I want you to go out on that stage today and tell the world exactly what you've done." "I can't," he sobbed, clutching my hand. "It will ruin me. I'll lose everything. The company, the reputation. It will all be gone." "Then you die," I said simply, pulling my hand away. "It's a very simple choice, Father, your legacy or your life, your heart, your choice." I walked away, leaving him alone in the shadows of the stage. The lights in the auditorium dimmed, and the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers, introducing the CEO of Halston Industries. Sterling walked out onto the stage, looking small and fragile in the bright spotlight. He walked toward the podium, where a teleprompter prepared by his massive PR team was already scrolling. It was full of the usual lies, talk of record profits, successful new trials, and the unbreakable unity of the Halston family. Sterling looked at the words, and I could see the sweat beads forming on his forehead. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned white. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice echoing through the massive hall. "The state of our company is—" He stopped. He tried to say strong, but the silent pulse inside his chest began to buzz with a warning vibration. It was a low-level frequency that only he could feel, a physical threat against the lie he was about to tell. He looked out into the front row, where I was sitting. I held up my tablet, the screen glowing with a live graph of his heart rhythm. I swiped my finger upward, just a fraction, increasing the sensitivity of the truth protocol. Sterling saw the movement and knew exactly what it meant. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, and I was the one who decided if he fell. Sterling took a deep, shuddering breath and looked away from the teleprompter. "The state of the company is critical," he gasped. A murmur of shock swept through the thousands of shareholders. This wasn't the speech they had been told to expect. "I have lied to you," Sterling continued, his voice getting stronger as the pain in his chest began to subside. "I have lied about our clinical trial numbers. I have inflated our quarterly assets by over 40% to keep our stock price high." Gasps erupted from the crowd, and on the massive digital screen behind him, I could see the Halston Industries stock price beginning to plummet in real time. It was a bloodbath. Knox, who had been released on bail and was watching from the wings, stepped out onto the edge of the stage, his face red with fury. "What are you doing, Dad?" Knox shouted, his voice caught by the microphones. "Shut up! You're destroying everything we've built." Sterling looked at his stepson, then back at the audience. "I'm doing this because I don't want to die," he yelled into the microphone, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm doing this because the truth is the only thing keeping my heart beating." Sterling wasn't done. He realized that to truly be free of the pain, he had to clear his entire emotional ledger, not just the corporate lies. I watched on my tablet as his stress markers began to level out, but there was still a deep, lingering dissonance in his cardiac rhythm. He had one more truth to tell. "5 years ago," Sterling stammered, tears now running freely down his face as he looked at the cameras. "I stood on a stage like this, and I disowned my daughter, Ophelia. I called her a broken instrument. I told the world she was a liability because she couldn't hear like the rest of us." He looked directly at me in the front row, his expression one of profound, pathetic regret. "But I was the one who was broken," he confessed, his voice shaking the entire auditorium. "I threw her away because her genius intimidated me. I was a small, jealous man who was afraid of a child's potential. Everything I have today is a hollow shell, built on the back of the daughter I betrayed." The silence in the room was heavy, almost physical. The shareholders, the press, the millions of people watching online, they were all witnessing the complete and total demolition of one of the world's most powerful men. Sterling had finally spoken the truth, and for the first time in 5 years, the frequency of his heart was perfectly, beautifully clear. Sterling took a step back from the podium, looking like a man who had just finished a marathon. "I am unfit to lead this company," he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. My heart belongs to Oral Tech now." He collapsed onto the stage, not from a surge of the heart monitor, but from pure, total exhaustion. Paramedics rushed from the sides of the stage to help him, but the audience wasn't looking at him. They were looking at me. I stood up and walked down the aisle, the sound of my heels on the floor the only thing anyone could hear. I climbed the stairs and walked over to the podium. I picked up the microphone, the same way he had ripped it from my hands 5 years ago. "My father is currently indisposed," I told the cameras, my voice echoing with a power that made the room vibrate. "But as the majority shareholder of Oral Tech, the entity that now owns the vast majority of Halston Industries' debt and intellectual property, I am taking immediate control of the empire." I looked out at the sea of faces, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to hide behind headphones or sensors. I had taken the broken instrument and used it to play a masterpiece of justice. I was no longer the daughter of a billionaire. I was the owner of his legacy. A few weeks later, I visited the city's high-security prison. I sat in the visitation room, looking through the glass at Knox. He had been arrested for corporate espionage, the break-in at my apartment, and several counts of financial fraud. He looked tired, his expensive hair and suit replaced by a dull orange jumpsuit. "Did you kill him?" Knox asked, his voice flat and hollow. "No," I said, leaning back in my chair. "He's alive. He's living in a small cottage on the coast, away from the city and the company. But he wears the monitor every single day. I've locked the encryption. He can never lie again or his heart will stop." Knox stared at me, a look of slow horror dawning on his face. "You've turned him into a puppet," he whispered. "No, Knox," I corrected him. "I've turned him into an honest man. For the first time in his life, he has to live by the truth. He's finally becoming a good man, whether he wants to be or not. He's becoming good, by force." I stood up and walked away, leaving Knox in his cell, the silence of the prison finally matching the silence I had lived in for so long. I sat in the massive CEO office at the top of the Halston building, the same chair my father had used to rule his empire. It was late, and the city lights below looked like a map of glowing frequencies. I reached up and removed my diamond-encrusted hearing aids, placing them on the desk. The world went silent, pure, beautiful, perfect silence. I looked at the tablet on my desk, which was still showing the data from Sterling's heart monitor. His heartbeat was steady, slow, and calm. He was asleep in his cottage by the ocean, and for the first time in his 70 years, he was an honest man. He wasn't scheming, he wasn't lying, and he wasn't hurting anyone. I placed my hand on the cold glass of the window, looking at my own reflection. I had spent years being told that I was broken, that I was a liability, and that the world was a place I wasn't meant to participate in. I had controlled the frequency of my father's heart to survive, but more importantly, I had finally found the frequency of my own worth. They said I couldn't hear the world, so I made the world listen to me.